This is Women in Linux. Welcome to the Women in Linux podcast, exposing women to information and careers in technology.
Thanks for joining Women in Linux with your hosts Tamika Reed and Dee Parler. This installment of our CTO series, we're chatting with Rachel Chalmers, VC and VP of Marketing of Unitive.
I'm Tamika Reed, and I saw you speak at VelocityConf in New York. Was it about a month ago or a month and a half ago?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, and I saw you mentioning, I guess, more along the lines of your venture into venture capitalist funding and studying psychology and so forth. And it's funny because one of my friends was talking about reading about psychology and venture capitalist funding, say, a week prior to that. So when I heard that, I was like, oh, she would be a great person for me to talk to, venture capitalist funding and psychology, and then amongst other things, and then just listening to your presentation as well, too. So I think I tweeted you that day as well, and you tweeted back, and here we are. I have a variety of topics, really looking over your, I won't say your portfolio, but your career path, I should say. It's been quite interesting.
Very non-standard.
Yeah, but it's non-standard to you, but standard to me. In the sense, if that makes sense. In the sense of looking at your background from computing and engineering and cloud and so forth, to me that's normal. Because that's what I aim to do with Women in Linux, is to expose women to the other side of tech, outside of coding, that you don't really hear about. You don't hear about women being a solutions architect or a storage engineer or, going into the path of being a CTO and what is that like? So that's what I aim to do. And I noticed that with your venture capitalists, you look at SaaS companies and IT infrastructure and business. I know you're interested in drones and Internet of Things and so forth. So that, to me, is the same to me. But then making the leap to venture capitalists is kind of like something totally different. So we could start there as to making your leap from looking at the industry and being in the industry as well, too, and making a leap to venture capitalists. Do you see some similarities or do you see a lot of differences?
That's a really interesting question. I was in research for 13 years. I actually was employee number 10 at 451 Research, which is the industry analyst firm where I spent 13 years covering infrastructure. And the founders were for journalists, actually British journalists that I'd gotten to know at our previous company. And we had this vision for how we could create a research company that would be quite different. We were competing with Gartner and Forrester, which you probably know very well, are two very well-established, very large industry analyst firms that primarily sell their research to buyers of large-scale IT. So when you're about to write a $1 million or $3 million check for some IBM systems, it really helps to have a Gartner report that you can throw on your boss's table and say, this is the best-in-class system that we can buy. So when we started 451, we had really, really formidable, very large competitors. And our ambition was to create something that would have a much more sort of original voice. We were very much inspired by publications like The Economist, which are, kind of sardonic and sharp and very insightful and topical. But to do that, we needed customers, and all of the big buy-side customers were already committed to these very large deals to Gartner and Forrester. But it turned out that Gartner and Forrester, because of their model, were not especially good at covering emerging tech or early-stage startup companies. And we were, because we were small and nimble and hungry and young. And so in about 2000, which is when we launched the company, we started spending a lot of time talking to these early stage companies. And that meant that our natural first set of customers was the venture capital firms that invested primarily in tech. So we ended up with about 400 of the biggest venture firms in America, in Israel and London, as some of the earliest clients for 451's research. And so I got to know a lot of the VC partners, both through work and socially. Mm-hmm. And I met Frank Artali when he was originally a chief operating officer at ZenSource, and then he went into Excel to be an entrepreneur in residence. And I met Nick Sturiali, who was the first investor in ZenSource as well. As part of covering ZenSource, I wrote about VMware and all of the early virtualization and cloud companies from that point of view. And I stayed in touch with Nick and Frank for years. And when I describe my career path as non-standard, what I mean is that for VCs, the traditional background is either to have been an entrepreneur or to have come up through the finance ranks in an investment banking role. Mm-hmm. But when Frank and Nick themselves decided to join forces and raise a fund of their own, they were looking around for principals. And because they both knew me as a researcher who'd called a bunch of very big trends in the industry, they decided to tap me and see if I wanted to try operationalizing the trend spotting ability that I'd shown as an analyst. And so that's how I ended up in venture. Partly by just getting to know two of the partners 10 years before they even thought about starting a firm together, and partly because I wrote about 1,000 early stage startup companies over a space of 13 years and mm-hmm. followed 8 of them all the way to IPO.
Mm-hmm. I saw those 8, Rackspace, Opsware, VMware, the other 5. But yeah, I saw those. I was former racker myself. So I understand how daunting that task was, because that was a lot of back and forth when I worked there as well too. But that is different going in, and so that's another interest to me as I was doing my research, not on just you, but as a totality of your path, understanding that mindset, because you have been in the industry and you know the industry can be vicious, and I'm sure making a leap to VC where there isn't a lot of women either can look the same or can be different. So how has that working in the field and then becoming a VC, have you seen a difference? Do you feel the same?
VC is certainly dominated by men, and men of a certain background, as I described. You know, typically people who went to Stanford or MIT or Harvard. Mm-hmm. The women who are in VC were, without exception, unbelievably welcoming, and I could call any of them and go and have coffee, and ended up becoming quite good friends with many of the women that I worked with. So one of the advantages of being in a tiny minority was that we could all get to know one another. And one of the really fortunate things that happened when Ignition Fund 5 was put together was that John Connors, the third partner in the fund, also hired a woman as a principal. And so Christina Bergman and I started at around the same time. And so there were 2 of us on the investment team, which helped a lot. Instead of being the one woman in the room, which I had frequently been when I was at 451, there were 2 of us. And so we could have different styles and different approaches, and that was a huge advantage. So I very consciously, knowing about the Ellen Power trial and knowing about the difficulty that a lot of women had in the industry, I very consciously built a lot of bridges and made a lot of allies with the other women who were working in VC.
Good. More like a support system as well too.
Yeah, and you know, frankly, an old girls network, you know, it helps to have people who, you know, are willing to sit down and share their experience with you and their insights. And it wasn't only men, though. It wasn't only women. There were plenty of men who spent a lot of time with me and helped me get up to speed as well. But I made a particular effort to reach out to women. and was really impressed at the time that even very senior women in the industry would make for me. And I try to pay that forward constantly. I'm always like clearing my schedule to spend time with younger investors or entrepreneurs who are women.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'd have to put you down on my calendar for when I need to make a phone call. Or I need to make a phone call. And so some of the other things I looked at are as well too is some of the things you're interested in, like the whole AR, VR, and from my perspective, getting the younger women in or younger girls who are in high school or even some of the older adults into AR, VR has been, I guess, a really particular interest of mine, and I think it helps to shape that experience. So I know there's something that you're into. I'm not sure how deep involved you are, but can you shed some light on how you see women playing a role in like the AR, VR world?
Sure. The interesting thing is that my connections to the virtual reality community actually go back to the mid-90s.
Okay.
The two authors of VRML, which was a web specification for creating VR within web pages, were Tony Parisi and Mark Pesce. And I met Mark when he was visiting Sydney back when I still lived in Australia. And over the course of many drinks one evening in a bar, he persuaded me that I really belonged in San Francisco and should consider moving out here. And about 7 or 8 years later, he called me and told me that he was thinking of moving to Sydney, and we had long conversations about him doing that. So we ended up swapping places. Mark is now a very big fish in the Australian technology industry, and I'm a very small fish in the San Francisco technology industry. But Mark and Tony were both unbelievably supportive when I first moved out here, and I got to know a lot of the early VR entrepreneurs through that, including Philip Rosedale, who was the founder of Linden Lab, who I met at one of O'Reilly's food camps back in the day. But in fact, my interest in VR and in a lot of the web technologies was gradually replaced over time with an interest in lower and lower levels of the infrastructure stack. And you'll understand this because of your Linux background. But my philosophy, I guess, is that software is the distillation of best practices and of our best knowledge about how to accomplish something. And therefore, that the lower in the stack you go, the bigger and more pervasive an influence each technology decision has. I started to see that software that was built on infrastructure that was by its nature inclusive and open and with published protocols or open source licenses created communities that, for all of their faults, were still more accessible and less gated than software that was proprietary and very expensive and whose source code was kept very secret. And this started a long exploration for me into deeper and deeper layers of the infrastructure stack. So when Ignition hired me and I had this technology background, they delighted in sending me out to sort of look at the science fiction sections like blockchain or drones or artificial intelligence or VR and augmented reality. But I always came at it from this point of view that the best investment, both from a financial point of view, but also from the point of view of where should you invest your time in order to have the biggest impact on the world, was at these underlying infrastructure layers. If you can have influence in the decisions that are made in those underpinnings, that influence has a beneficial effect on everything that's built on top of those platforms.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
Into another question, because I know you guys invest in SaaS, and then from your perspective now, as a VC perspective, you're from how you view it, it's at a lower level. But can you look at it as a lower level as a VC when over here you got to raise this capital? So now I see you're looking at SaaS. So do you still look at the lower level of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what has happened with the industry is that when in 2006 Amazon launched Elastic Compute Cloud, when I first came out here in 1998, all of my friends would raise a Series A and they'd buy a Sun E10K, which were those big fridge server boxes. You probably remember them back in Stack days.
Right.
5 years later, people would raise a Series A and they'd get a contract with 365 Main, which was one of the early big colos. 5 years after that, they often wouldn't raise a Series A until much later because you could start to build things on Amazon that didn't cost anywhere near as much as just building the basic infrastructure for your startup did back in 1998 before you could just fire up some servers online. And so that changed the economics of how to do a startup. It also changed what infrastructure actually is. Right. Amazon owns, hosted servers now. It owns things like Lambda. It owns online storage. The fundamental software that's being written now that has those kind of very large influential effects that I'm looking at are migrating to what we used to think of as application layer functions. And so that's what's pulling us into some of these software as a service areas. In particular, what I've been doing recently is I've taken an operational role in one of Ignition's portfolio companies, which is actually a SaaS vendor, and it's called Unitive.
Okay.
And what Unitive is doing, and this does loop back to your original question, what Unitive is doing is trying to apply the last 20 years of really groundbreaking research in behavioral economics and psychology to the hiring function. So as it became apparent to me that you needed to have different sets of eyes looking at this infrastructure code in order to build the kind of infrastructure that would be inclusive, that, more multi-perspective teams were much more interesting in the terms of the software that they produced and more attractive investment candidates when I looked at them from the Ignition point of view. I started to realize that the process of building those teams that have many sets of eyes is actually as fundamental to the creation of software. It's even a step back from the kind of infrastructure I was talking about. It's really important to build infrastructure that's inclusive. And the best way to build infrastructure that's inclusive is to have enough people in the room that if you're about to make a bad decision, somebody will put up their hand and say, that's a bad decision and here's why. Right. So what Unitive does is we look at the research that's been done on how to nudge people into using their rational brain instead of making snap decisions and saying, this guy seems great. He reminds me a lot of George, who was great in this role. We'll hire him because we want a team that feels really comfortable and that feels really like nothing is changing. Instead of doing that, we're saying, well, the research shows, the evidence shows that if you want to hire the best possible candidate for a job, their gender doesn't matter. The school that they went to doesn't matter. Their ethnicity doesn't matter. The key predictors of success are their raw cognitive ability and their agreeableness, their willingness to work on a team, their congruence with whatever your corporate values are. And so we've created a hiring process that's designed to elicit that kind of thinking while also helping hiring managers move through that process more efficiently.
And does it also take care of the, cultural fit phenom that everyone has? Like, would you be able to go out for a beer afterwards? Are they okay to talk about Game of Thrones while we work? That scenario that a lot of women end up falling into.
Exactly what you mean. Again, having been the only woman in the room, you and I have both been in this situation where we're like, do you feign interest in football or do you feel like an outsider?
Right, and what's funny about it is it's kind of a double-edged sword. You may watch Game of Thrones and you may actually like beer, but I just don't want to do those things with you.
Exactly. So you ask a really interesting question, and there's two answers. One is that we directly address the culture fit issue. There's a pop-up when you're entering interview feedback into Unitive. If you say not a good culture fit in your interview feedback, our software will pop up a window and say what you mean, be more precise, because culture fit is one of those weasel words that's used to justify a lot of honestly straight up prejudice. It's like, this is not someone I'd want to have a beer with, and therefore we shouldn't hire them. Even if that person is whip smart and completely dedicated to the corporate mission, if somebody doesn't feel comfortable around them, then they should have to justify that. They should have to explain themselves, and that should go down in the record. And you don't have to hire that person. But particularly as companies get larger and start to think about listing on the public stock exchange, you have to keep records of your interview notes for 3 years, and you have to demonstrate that your hiring process is not systemically biased. So our software becomes a system of record for that. But much more to the point, if someone is saying, oh, this person isn't a culture fit, they should have to say exactly what they mean. If what they mean is, I just don't want to have a beer with this person, then they need to understand that that's not acceptable in a grown-up workplace. The other deeper question that this touches on is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is there was this fantastic McKinsey report a couple of years ago called Diversity Matters, which found that gender diverse teams perform 15% better than teams that are not gender diverse. This was a study of public companies. And public companies that had ethnically diverse executive teams performed 35% better. And so you look at these numbers and you think, why on earth are we still hiring the old way when, the numbers are so stark and transparent? If this was a public health finding, then there would immediately be a huge government effort to try and fix it. The reason is, it turns out diverse teams are much less comfortable than homogeneous teams. That thing where if you're about to make a dumb decision and somebody puts their hand up and says that decision is bad and here's why, that's really uncomfortable. That's a really difficult situation, especially if you're the person who came up with the dumb idea. And I've been that person, so I can attest to the fact that it's not.
It's funny that you say that. It's funny that you say that, because in my group, in Women in Linux, I can probably be harsh with my members, but they're going to listen to this and understand why. I'm harsh only because I try to tell people that when you go to work, in particular in IT, in particular when you're talking about being a solutions architect or working in Linux or anything of that nature, that specify you are probably going to be the only woman in the room.
Yep.
And you're probably going to be if you're a minority, you're probably going to be the only minority as well. Yep. And what I try to reinforce is make sure you learn how to have a voice. And your voice doesn't necessarily always have to be vocal. Your voice can be in your actions. Your voice can be in how you present a topic or how you take on a project that someone else didn't want to take on. And so I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that everyone is always going to look at you and say, oh my God, you're the greatest thing that ever happened. However, it gives you a chance to show who you are and the efforts that you can make. Because the last thing you need is not being able to be heard and not being able to, sitting at the table and being invisible.
Yes. Yeah.
Or sitting at the table and saying the very same thing, but because your voice wasn't loud enough or because you didn't project loud enough, someone else goes ahead and says that for you, and they're like, yeah, Jim, that was good. But
exactly.
You just said that. So I speak on self-confidence, understanding how to use your power when you're in the room, and that comes from understanding the people in the room with you as well.
It's so true, and any woman who's had a career as long as yours and mine in this industry has had to painfully and slowly acquire those skill sets, the ability to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, the ability to shrug it off when some guy restates your idea and everybody applauds and attributes it to him. It's worth thinking about the shadow side of that, because what is happening as the industry is starting to change is that a group of privileged people who've spent 20 years in the industry and have never been the only person of their kind in the room are now starting to get challenged on their assumptions.
Right.
In a way that they never have before. So you and I have had 20 years of growing a thick skin and getting used to sitting with our discomfort and understanding what it means to represent. Now a group of people who've never had to contend with any of that for their entire careers are being confronted for the first time.
Right.
And, it's not on us to be compassionate, but I think we need to understand that the discomfort is real, the sense that the universe, the technology industry was organized entirely for their benefit is suddenly starting to be shaken. And that's a real change for them, and it's a real loss. And I think that accounts for a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the heat in the conversations that we see. What comforts me is the thought that the demographic change is inevitable. In 2022, the workforce will be 47% female and 44% non-white. And what the data is telling us is that workforce will be more productive and will make smarter decisions and will do better work. It will be less comfortable for people who don't adapt to those changes, but it will be able to solve harder problems better.
That kind of raises another point. I know you worked on the ADA initiative. I'm not sure where you fell into that on the ADA initiative.
On the executive board for 4.5 to 5 years. Yeah.
Okay. And then I know the information is still up. It's licensed as long as you're free to use it, as long as you give claim and credit to using the license as well. But that initiative was so important. Do you see anyone picking that back up?
Yeah, about the ADA initiative, for your listeners who aren't familiar with it, it was founded by Valerie Aurora, who is a Linux kernel hacker, and Mary Gardner, who's a very, very brilliant computational linguist, also a fellow Australian. And what they did was put together a nonprofit in response to a series of sexist incidents and even assaults that had been taking place in the open source world, including at open source conferences such as ApacheCon and one of the Ruby on Rails conferences. And so the first thing the ADA initiative did was we created anti-harassment policies for use at conferences, which detail both the behavior that's expected from conference attendees and this was critical, I think, a protocol for how conference organizers should respond if a complaint was brought to them. And I'm incredibly proud of that work because each year more and more conferences adopt anti-harassment policies that are based on the ADA initiative's initial template. And I think that's gone a long way towards addressing both the incidents of sexual inappropriateness at conferences and towards making conference organizers feel that there are concrete steps that they can take to make conferences more accessible for women and other minorities. Out of the anti-harassment work, we started to develop codes of conduct for communities. We also set up some training around both imposter syndrome, addressing this sense that a lot of women have that I alone am faking it. The rest of you are incredibly competent, but I am a fraud who is going to be uncovered at any moment. And we also put together ally workshop training, which was directed at people from privileged groups, primarily men, but other privileged groups, to teach them how they could be better allies to women and to people of color in online communities.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
So the ADA initiative wound up, but what has happened in the aftermath is I've seen all of these organizations that I call children of ADA start to grow up, and some of them are directly related to the ADA initiative, like Change Set Consulting, run by Sumana Harihareshwar, who served on the board with me. And some are more distantly related. So the one I would really call out that I think is super interesting at the moment is Project Include, which includes, just to pull together all of these threads, Ellen Powell, who was in the Kleiner Perkins lawsuit, but who is also a very interesting thinker and speaker about technology in her own right. And Bethany Blunt, who was a Facebook engineer, and also a veteran of Linden Lab, just to bring it all the way back to infrastructure for virtual reality. Right. And Project Include, like the ADA initiative, but it's still running now, published sets of guidelines for both startup companies and for venture capital firms themselves on how to be more inclusive of women and underrepresented minorities in the work that they do. Project Include was most recently in the news when Ellen wrote a blog post saying that the group is going to distance itself from Y Combinator and no longer collaborate with Y Combinator because of Sam Altman's position on keeping Peter Thiel as a part-time partner in spite of his documented links with the Trump campaign. So I'm really excited about Project Include. I've spent a lot of time talking to the women involved, and I expect great things from them.
Yeah, I've been following them as well too, and I knew exactly what you were talking about. I was like she's probably going to say Project Include, but I just wanted to see if we were on the same page.
And there's lots of others. There's Carolyn Simard, who is another veteran of the ADA Initiative Board, works with the Clayman Institute for Gender Studies at Stanford, and they have a program where Silicon Valley startups can sign up and send their executives for training in how to address gender issues in the workplace. There's a bunch of others that I'll kick myself for not reeling off, but the ADA initiative was like a seed pod that burst open, and now all of the seeds are floating around the world, and it's really exciting to see what's happening.
Which leads me to another question. You talked about diversity and underrepresented groups and so forth and so on. Inside your Ignition project or Ignition partners, how are you guys tackling, or I shouldn't say guys, I should say you all, be inclusive here. How are you tackling diversity with VC funding for women and minorities? Because I read the model view culture piece that you wrote, the 5 reasons not to raise venture capital funding, and that's where I got the 8 that came through out of the 1,000.
Yep.
Right. How do you handle minorities and women with VC funding? Like, how does that, I guess, diversity look from your perspective?
One of the things I'm proudest of is that in the 13 years it had existed before Christina and I came on board, Ignition had invested in 2 startups led by women. And in the 3 years that Christina and I were on the investing team, we invested in 4. And it's not that Christina and I particularly championed those projects. One of them was Frank's. 3 of them were Nick Sturiali's. My theory is that because Christina and I were in a leadership role in the partner meetings where these women were pitching, it was easier for all 3 partners to see women in leadership roles on the other side of the table. And as a result, we're in these 4 very exciting companies, one of which is actually Christina's own. She started a company up in Seattle called Integris. One of which is Unitive, where I'm now running marketing, and the other 2 of which have very, very strong female engineers on the founding team as well. And they're 4 of the most exciting companies in the Ignition portfolios. So it's a beautiful illustration of why representation is important. It's not even that Christina and I were continually banging the drum saying we've got to invest in women. It's more that when there are already 2 women in the room, the woman investor who comes in to pitch is not the only woman in the room, and so that particular bit of cognitive load is taken away from her, and she's free to be herself rather than an avatar representation of her gender. We did much less well with other underrepresented minorities, I will say immediately.
And that's kind of like, like where I'm at from reading your article and looking at tons and tons of videos and, TED Talks, the whole nine. Reading that and, filtering information, but it can be convoluted. It can be the information can be a distraction more than anything as to, one, how you should pitch, what you should say, how to build your team. And I often preach this all the time when I look at, all the entrepreneur programs that are out there, like, hey, come here, you don't need any tech to build it, to build your idea out, which is great. But I always go back to the point of, how do you know who to trust? And how do you know if the person that's working with you is actually building what you really need? Or where do you build your tech at? I often say, you have the background. I have the background of, computing resources and Amazon and Google Cloud and so forth and so on. But the person that's the CEO doesn't have that. Or sometimes they do, depending on the role that they've taken in this project. So from your perspective, I guess this would be from an entrepreneur perspective, how do you coach women on making sure they're getting the best person for the job?
It's such a great question, and it really cuts to the heart of what I'm working on right now and what I'm thinking about. This whole question of how do we combine human ingenuity in the most efficient ways to tackle the enormous problems that we're facing. It turned out, and I mentioned this in the talk at Velocity, it turns out that all of the really hard problems in investing are psychological problems. And the biggest insights I gleaned, as I mentioned, were from the psychology of trauma, because that's just how difficult entrepreneurship is. It turns out that maybe the hardest infrastructural problem that comes up in field after field that I look at, it's common across drones and artificial intelligence and VR, AR and infrastructure software and software as a service. It's just, how do you build a team that has a very high level of trust, a very high level of alignment, and very high bandwidth communications between each other? And this is why I keep returning to the behavioral economics and the psychology research, because our understanding of how human beings think and of how we work together and collaborate has been transformed completely in my lifetime, and even since I was at college 25 years ago. And all of this research that's coming out teaches us or presents us with data and evidence that we can incorporate into our practice and continually refine. I've already forgotten your question. It's about how to coach women entrepreneurs.
Right. And it's all of that. It's hard. It's like I speak on it because I and I'm not trying to cut you off. I'm just really passionate about it. It's because we say go build this. You're an entrepreneur. Go build your project here. Go build this. Go build that. But nobody ever talks about the bare bones of that, right? The bare bones of you need that. You need the computing resources. You need a CTO. Well, what is a CTO, and what does that CTO do? And I speak on this because I'm starting, and that's why I reached out to you about the CTO mission. Is because we have to get to the point where we're grooming people to be CTOs if we're talking about entrepreneurship here, because those are the ones that are going to come in. They're gonna grind, and they don't necessarily want to be out in the forefront, but they can if they had to. But they're going to get the job done efficiently the way they need to get it done with the proper training.
And one of the most encouraging things I'm seeing is that there are, in the generation sort of 10 years younger than me, and there are tons and tons of really, really impressive women engineers. So Lyndon, again, was an unbelievably fertile source. Charity Majors, who's starting Honeycomb IO, was another graduate of Lyndon Labs. Gus Andrews, who's at ThoughtWorks now, was another Lyndon Labs alum. Melinda Byerly, who's running Timeshare CMO. So it was one of those companies that, because it was very consciously inclusive in its hiring, just created this generation of very, very technical women entrepreneurs who are a constant delight to me. So I am seeing more and more very, very technical women coming up the ranks. But I'm also going to push back a little bit and say, we've created, as an industry, we've created this mythology around coding, and you know exactly the guys I'm talking about when I say that there are engineers who think that the only reason anybody would be not an engineer is because they're not smart enough to be an engineer. Right. Coding is not all that. There's certainly a difference between a 10x coder and a mediocre coder.
If I could see you right now, I'll hug you.
I am here to tell you that most of the coders in the Valley are mediocre. I'll get in trouble for this. And it's not that hard to understand.
No, I could hug you for this, because this is something that I have so many words, but it's just something that I talk about. Like I look at it as if like like coding is going to save your whole entire life. And don't get me wrong, I think doing coding is great, but you have to learn how to combine skills and switch lanes. Yep. And combining those skills and switching lanes, that's what saves your life, because now you're able to adjust and move about freely through the cabin, as my co-founder would say, to do what you need to do what you want to do, and to make an effort to change the industry how you want to see it shaped.
Yes.
But when you have just that one lane, you can't see the other. You can't see anything else. And and that's why I focus on being a CTO and grooming. When Ursula leaves from Xerox, there won't be any Black women on the Fortune 500 index.
Right.
It's only been 15 companies that have been ran by Black men, Black women in the history of the Fortune 500. So to me, that's a evident problem. And how do we change that, and how do we solve that? Again, in your words, you have to get back to the lower level. I call it getting back to the basics. Yes. And building that foundation and understanding that foundation. But that foundation doesn't necessarily just have to be coding. That foundation can be a variety of things that include coding.
Yes. Yep. That's exactly right. It's not that hard to pick up enough computer science to, be able to analyze a system, to be able to get a feel for whether a product is a real product or not, to be able to get a feel for whether an engineer is telling you the truth or just blowing smoke. It is very, very hard to put together a functional team. It is very hard to make good decisions, to prioritize in a difficult market with a product that's not scaling as you hoped it would. And to me, those psychological skills, those, oft maligned soft skills, are actually the ones that will get you further ahead. I mean, your statistic about the paucity of Black executives in senior positions, the reason that crunches my heart is because I think of all of the human potential we're just dropping on the floor. I think of all of the problems in the world that need to be solved, and how desperately we need smart people working on these problems. And we think that the only smart people are called Steve and went to Stanford. It's just obviously wrong. Unless we can bring more people to the table, we just can't even begin to do the work that's in front of us.
And I get so passionate, and I apologize for cutting you off, but it's just one of those one of the lines, or one of the things that I've seen out of my 20 years. Like when I look at boards and so forth and so on, I always ask the question, like, I'll get someone to ask me, well, what do you think? I was like, well, what I think is, how do I get there? And they're like, where? I was like, on the screen, that PowerPoint presentation that you had with the org chart, How do I get on that org chart? That's what I'm looking at. Like, what do I need to do to get there? The answer is you always have great opportunities. Talk to us after the meeting, and then the meeting ends and nobody talks and nobody has a plan and nobody knows what you can do.
Yep.
Because they all were friends. They knew somebody that knew somebody. They were in the military together, and then they just hired a friend. So I just didn't fit into that, huh? Okay, well, the next thing that's left, you go be an entrepreneur. And so then you start being an entrepreneur, and then you look at, I need marketing. I need to figure out if I'm gonna be an S Corp, C Corp, 501(c)(3), 501(c)(6). What do I do?
Yep.
And managing all of that and still surviving in life.
Yep.
Is all of that rolled into one, and that's what you're faced with as a woman. Compound that and be a minority. Yeah. Oh, dumb thoughts.
I will plug Brad Feld's Foundry Press books, Startup Boards, Startup Communities, and Startup Life. Were really, really incredibly helpful to me when I was finding my feet in venture. And I was flicking through Startup Life again today and remembering just what a good read it is. So those are 3 very, very helpful books. And then for any entrepreneurs out there who want to start thinking about raising financing, Venture Deals, also from Foundry Press, is the Bible there.
It's called what again?
Venture Deals.
Venture Deals.
Yeah, and the pitch is that if you read that book, you will be smarter than your VC or your lawyer. And that's probably true.
Okay. I'll make sure I grab those tonight and read through them. I'm going to try audio. Hope they'll be on audio, and I'll try to listen to them. Is there anything you want to add, anything that you want to say before we wrap it up? I know it's about your time, so here's your shameless plug.
Fantastic. So I'm running marketing now for Unitive, which I've mentioned a couple of times. It operationalizes best practices around hiring based on all of the academic research we could possibly find that had any bearing on this. In August, we launched the Team Edition, which is free for anyone to use. So if any of your listeners has an open rec or needs to write a job description or has 100 resumes sitting on their desk and needs to review them, or wants to run a structured interview instead of sitting confused in front of a candidate trying to think of something to ask, please hop on over to unitive.works. We've got a unusual top-level domain, WORKS. But come over and have a look, sign in to our product for free and kick the tires and let us know what you think. You can find me on Twitter at Rachel Chalmers, and I'm really, really interested to talk to anybody about entrepreneurship or software or hiring or the psychology of being a woman in the tech industry or any of the topics we've discussed today.
Thank you. I most definitely thank you for taking your time to talk to not just about women in general, but just about, the gamut of entrepreneurship, from VC funding to being a woman to getting into the field, and even some of the skill sets that you may need. Thank you for your time. I'm sure my listeners are going to have a lot of questions, and hopefully I can get those over in an email and I have to tweet them to you, because then you can thoroughly answer the way you want to, and probably write a blog about it as well.
Tamika, it's been such a pleasure. As you've probably gathered, I am basically an unreconstructed 90s tech idealist. I still think that software is a really, really good way to tackle the big problems in our society, and I encourage all listeners to come and join us in the great work.
Well, we thank you, and we'll try to pump out as many women in technology as we can through Women in Linux. That's my goal, is to get women out there to unexplored territories, from gaming to drones, to being in drone competition, to flying planes. So we're trying to get them out there.
But that's the future I want to live in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Women in Linux podcast. Women in Linux is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization created to get women involved in the field of IT using Linux as a foundation. You can connect with Women in Linux through social media at Women in Linux on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. To join weekly meetups, go to meetups.com/Women in Linux. For more information and to connect with Women in Linux, go to www.womeninlinux.com.